Hi. Today we're going to address the question, how important is practice when it comes to spiritual awakening, spiritual realization? The first thing I want to say about that is that many people will find this question absurd, that practice is so obviously required to wake up, that practice is so intimately tied to the process of spiritual realization that to even ask that question is somewhat nonsensical. On the other side of the coin, there are people who would say that to even speak of practice, seeking a spiritual state or a state of enlightenment, the sense of being a practicer, the sense of being a doer or an agent, is itself the fundamental misunderstanding or mistake that filters out the direct experience of natural reality. Upon first examination, this question may sound very introductory, very basic. And to some degree it is. There are some important pointers for starting out on this journey that we can make here. Now, it also comes into play later in the process of realization, and in subtle ways can actually be a hindrance if somebody is not able to navigate this seeming paradox, the seeming contradiction between practice and surrender, between intention and surrender. So we're going to touch on this both from a beginner's perspective and also from a more advanced perspective in this video. So for a beginner, I think it's important and valuable to establish a regular meditative practice. It doesn't really matter what type of meditation, although a very simple, basic, or natural meditation can be helpful. I have a section in my book, a chapter in my book, called Techniques and Practices, and one of the sections is natural meditation, where I describe it pretty clearly. Now, there are a lot of other ways to approach it. There's a Zen term called shikantaza, and they also describe an approach to this sort of natural meditation. But as a very basic way of meditating, this sometimes is really accessible for people. Interestingly, because there's sort of no technique to it, other people can be a bit put off by it, and having a specific, although simple technique can be valuable. But we'll talk about the simple approach of natural meditation first, and then I'll give a little bit of a primer on other meditative techniques. So natural meditation is all about sitting and doing nothing. Sitting, closing your eyes, or keeping your eyes slightly open and seeing a few feet in front of you, and then stopping. Don't make anything. Don't do anything. Don't try to filter anything. There are no goals here, which means having no thoughts is not a goal. So there can be thoughts. There can be hundreds of thoughts, dozens of thoughts, subtle thoughts, gross thoughts, confusing thoughts, clear thoughts. It doesn't really matter. Whatever's happening is just what's happening. We simply let our attention move naturally with the flow of experience. If there are sounds, if we're distracted by something in the environment, or our attention moves to a sound, or our breathing, or a clock, that's perfectly okay. We're not trying to stop anything from happening. We're not trying to focus our attention. We're not trying to modulate our attention. So wherever our attention moves, whatever occurs, whatever feeling, sensation, thought, sound, movement, visual experience occurs, it's already right. It's already the right one. Yeah? So this is about not doing. It's about not being the manager, not being the one that is trying to be in control of experience. Very simple. So that's one way of meditating. And if you're able to do that, if that, of course it's not a doing, but if you get that, if you can sit with that and it comes upon you naturally and you vibe with it, that's great. If that is not accessible, another very simple practice is breath counting. You just stop, sit, get into an alert but relaxed position, and start to notice your breath. The sensation of breathing, the movement of breath. It's okay if there are other things noticed, sounds in the environment, thoughts, it's okay. But we're kind of preferentially moving our attention to the breath. In, out. We're not trying to control it, change it, or modulate it. Just notice. It's almost as if we're meeting the breath. Our attention meets the knowing of breathing very gently. Now, when your attention is sort of moving in and out with the breath, if that's a meditative experience for you, if you're able to stay with that without too much effort, then that's it. That's fine. You don't have to add to that. Now, if you very easily get lost in thoughts, or you feel like you're struggling or don't know what to do, or your mind is just constantly active, you can start by, in the same way, putting attention on the breath. And then on the out breath, count 1. 2. And proceed to 10. There's nothing magical about 10, it's just the number we choose. Now if you lose track, start at 1. If you get lost in thought for 5 minutes, start at 1. If you find yourself counting to 12, 13, 14, just start back at 1. And you don't need to count out loud, you can just voice it in your mind. 1, 2, 3, and that's it. The counting just gives a little bit of a focus of the mind back into the present. And work with this. Sit with it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes a day, and see how that feels. If it starts to become reasonably easy to stay with those numbers, with the counting, and not lose track too often, you can start to drop the number and just focus on the breathing very gently. And at some point you may just notice you're already naturally meditating. You're meditating without an object, without a goal, and that's great. So yeah, for a beginner, I usually recommend something like this. I would establish a daily regimen, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, even 30, if that feels comfortable to you. There will be times at the beginning where you feel a little uncomfortable during meditation, but if you keep at it, if you do it daily, it often gets quite enjoyable. You'll still have fluctuations. There'll be days when it's not as restful or relaxing. There's more thoughts or more intense emotions. Other times it'll feel very peaceful, and that's normal. There are no long-term goals with this meditation either. You're not trying to get to a better meditative place. You're not trying to become a better meditator. Yeah, don't fall into that trap. Yeah, because the technique is always here. It always leads you here, not into the future, not into a goal, not into the past, not into a better state of being a meditator, right? So, so for a beginner, I would often recommend a practice like this. Now, if you want to strike while the iron's hot and you have a deep, intense yearning to get under suffering, to find out what's what, as my Zen teacher used to say, to experience reality unfiltered, to know what your face looked like before your parents were born, or at least penetrate what it is people actually mean by that phrase, that you trust that there is something beyond the veils of perceptual delusion, then I would add to this. I would add to this basic meditative practice. I would add some form of inquiry. And there are many ways to learn inquiry. You can read about Ramana Maharishi or his book called Who Am I? In my book I have an entire chapter on inquiry, and then I have very specific inquiries for First Awakening in the last couple chapters. So I would say if you're starting out and you haven't gone through that perceptual shift, that fundamental shift in identity that is unmistakable, you've heard about it, you've met people who've had it, but you haven't gone through it yourself, I would recommend adding inquiry. Now, you can do that in addition to meditation. You can do it while you're meditating. You can actually do it any time of the day. You can do it while you're in activity, it's fine. But good inquiry, inquiring into the nature of reality, into your own identity. Who am I? Yeah? So, from a beginner's perspective, I do recommend some aspect, some type of practice, and I think it's valuable. I think it's definitely worthwhile. I wouldn't avoid it because you've been watching non-duality videos and you think you don't have to do anything. Now, there is a very important aspect to this process, and it first comes into play right as you approach awakening. And there is this massive push that it comes right up to the brink, it comes right up to the edge, right up to, it might even feel like a cliff edge. It might feel like the edge of your life. It will feel like the edge of your life. And all of the fear and defense mechanisms might come up during this approach. And that a good inquiry practice will bring you here. But at some point, surrender will happen. And you'll know what spontaneity is, finally. You'll know what doesn't need to be practiced, because it already is, and it could never not be. You'll know what it feels like to finally just let go of the need to constantly defend yourself, to constantly try to find a solution, to question yourself endlessly. Yeah, that's what an awakening is about. That's that initial shift. It's a very fundamental shift in identity, where the small, discrete, self-oriented world we were trapped in, the endless seeking, was all in error. It was an error of perception, and it just stops. And that is surrender. There's a surrendering that happens there that is completely beyond any technique or beyond any practice. It's undeniable. It's your first real taste of unfiltered reality. And it's a wonderful taste, because you see, feel, intuit beyond this lifetime, that there's something here, something going on that is completely beyond you. And yet, it is all of this. It encompasses all of this. And in that, and as that, you're okay. Everything is okay. Everything is okay just the way it is. Every thought is okay. Every sensation is okay. It's all okay. And that is undeniable. It's a self-validating knowing. And so there is a big movement that comes out of nowhere, that is a surrendered movement. It is not about you, and it's not about anything you did. It's grace. Yeah. So from that standpoint, and after that initial shift, you start to really get what it means that in one way of speaking, you can't practice this. You can't practice reality, because reality is, always has been, always will be just this. Could never be other than this. And so once you shift enough to experience that in your marrow, then you start to really understand what some types of speaking, some types of transmission of people who have realized this mean when they say, that there is no practicer, there's no one that can practice, that all techniques and movements of the seeker, the seeking mind, just reinforce the delusion of separation. And to some degree that's true. Now, here's the thing. After awakening, you start to understand and intuit what paradox is all about. Because before awakening, everything is either this or that. It's yes or no, self or other. After awakening, it can start feeling very different. There can be self and other. There can be yes and no. There can be up and down, or an up without a down, or a down without an up. To the mind, this doesn't make any sense. But when you start to feel what the Heart Sutra means when it says freed of delusive hindrance, you can feel what it's like, what it is to be without view, to be without fixation of any kind. And when you sense that, that's freedom. Yeah? So from that place, things are quite paradoxical. You will go through periods where you may not practice. Your practice is surrender. Your practice is no practice, and that's important. You have to let go of the doer. You have to let go of the one that wants to control everything, because the control is making you feel separate. And you'll go through other periods where it's very important to practice, and specifically it's important to inquire. It's important to inquire into very specific perceptual distortions. And without that type of inquiry, without that willingness to continue to investigate your true nature until you go all the way through the bottom and just keep on going until there's nothing left but the investigation, there's nothing left but the mystery itself, and it just carries itself on and on and on. Until that point, it's easy to overlook a fear, an existential fear that is keeping you from wanting to move toward a less identified state, a less fixed position, because the mind, the ego, wants predictability. It wants consistency. It wants to know. It wants to be in control. But reality doesn't feel like that. Reality doesn't need control, because reality is everything. It's everything and it's no thing. And it's everything arising as and from no thing, and vice versa. It's one distinct experience, one sound, one sensation, coming forth as everything, and never even coming into being. It's too intimate, too real, too close, too everywhere to be physically manifest, to be an object. So at some point, the fascination with reality, the drive to clarify, to dig in, to see the most subtle perceptual filters, comes into contact with a great rest, a great spontaneity. And they're not two things, they're not two truths. And to, now we're talking deep stage realization, but to lean too much toward one side is a subtle fixation. And it's important to always recognize that the relative is the absolute, and the absolute is the relative. That surrender, that natural, unmanifest, living, vivid, intimate truth is also the process leading to it, seemingly. They're not apart, and Dogen has a great term, practice enlightenment. He's pointing right to this. When you see that there is no past or future, there is no time, there's no temporality, and there's no space, then there's nothing apart from anything to return to it. It's already. And that there is no time, there is no path, and there's nothing progressing on that path, and yet the experience of being on a path and the experience of progression from the human perspective seems to be there. But it doesn't have to be negated. It doesn't have to be denied. In fact, it can be celebrated. And so this is practice enlightenment. So this is, to me, the sort of ultimate answer is that the question itself goes completely away at some point. But until that point, if you fixate on one side or the other, if you're rigidly attached to practices and rituals and control and mapping and that sort of thing, you often have an intellectual component that's putting its finger on the scale. And on the other hand, if it's all about there's nothing to do, there's no one to do it, there's no such thing as a practice, any practice just gets you, revs up the seeking energy, etc., there's probably a finger on the scale of a sort of unwillingness to let go to a deeper level. Actually, on both sides, I think there's a bit of an unwillingness or fear to let go to a deeper level. But it's best to be on alert for both of these tendencies. So hopefully this video was helpful. Let me know what you thought of it, and let me know, do you lean on one side or the other naturally? I could tell you at the beginning, I definitely leaned on the side of practice. I would have just thought, people don't wake up without years and years and years and probably lifetimes of practice. But it turns out it's not quite like that. There are people waking up spontaneously all over. So that really was surprising to me. But I do, now I've met so many people at various stages of realization, and I've met people who definitely lean to the other side of things. That they're so intuitive that it doesn't make sense to practice. It's more just feel. It's more release, surrender. It's very natural. So someone on that side, I might kind of push to the middle the other way. But I'm curious what your experience is. Do you tend toward one of these sides? Also, is this clear? Is this confusing? Was it helpful? Let me know. Thanks.